The night was silent on the highway when suddenly everything changed. A school bus filled with children had been forced to stop in the middle of the road. Dark figures appeared from the shadows, surrounding the vehicle with threatening gestures and sharp movements. Inside the bus, small faces pressed against the windows, eyes wide with fear, waiting for help that seemed impossible. In the distance, headlights cut through the darkness, approaching fast. A truck roared louder and louder, and in that moment, the fate of everyone on that road would be decided by one man behind the wheel. If you believe this story deserves to be told, like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. João had been a truck driver for more than 20 years, a man whose life was built on the long stretches of asphalt that cut across the country. To most people, he was just another face among thousands of drivers who carried food, medicine, and goods to distant towns. But to those who knew him, João was steady and reliable, a man who lived simply, worked hard, and kept his word. He was not a hero, at least not until that night. His days began early, often before the sun had risen. He would load his truck with supplies and check every detail of the vehicle. The engine, the brakes, the tires, nothing was left to chance. Years on the road had taught him that a small mistake could cost lives, and João had no desire to be careless. By the time most families were waking up, João was already hours into his journey, sipping bitter coffee from a roadside cafe, watching the world pass by from behind the windshield. Despite the long hours of solitude, João found a strange peace in the road. He liked the rhythm of the tires against the pavement, the sight of the horizon opening before him. His life was ordinary, almost invisible, but it was honest. He earned enough to provide for his family, and though he missed birthdays and holidays, he carried the quiet pride of knowing that his work mattered. That night he had been driving for hours, carrying a load of basic goods to a small town in the interior. The air was cool, and the highway seemed endless, lit only by the glow of his headlights. He hummed softly to himself, fighting the weariness of the long drive, his thoughts drifting to the warm bed, waiting at the next rest stop. He was, at heart, just a man trying to finish his shift and get home safely. Nothing in his routines suggested what was about to happen. João was not a soldier, not a police officer, not a man who had ever looked for danger. But he did believe in something very simple. If you see someone in need, you help. It was a value his father had taught him on their small farm years ago, and one that João carried into every mile he drove. And so, when he turned the corner and saw the strange glow of brake lights in the distance, he felt the first spark of unease. Something about the scene did not belong on that quiet stretch of road. At first, he thought it might be a broken-down vehicle, another traveler in need of assistance. He was used to stopping for people stranded on the shoulder, offering tools or a lift to the nearest station. But the longer he looked, the more unusual it seemed. A large bus stood still on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking, but there was movement around it, shadows where none should be. João frowned, tightened his grip on the wheel, and slowed his truck. In that moment, João was still just a truck driver. He was a man with deliveries to make, a schedule to keep, and a family waiting at home. Yet destiny has a way of finding ordinary people in ordinary places. On that road, in that hour, João was about to discover that even a man who never sought out heroism can be called to act like one. He adjusted his seat, took a breath, and prepared to approach. The bus loomed larger in the distance, the shadows shifting like predators around it. João had no idea that within minutes his choices would decide whether dozens of innocent children lived or died. As João's truck drew closer to the bus, his unease deepened. At first glance, it looked like a routine breakdown, but the details refused to fit together. The bus was stopped awkwardly, angled partly onto the shoulder as if it had been forced to halt suddenly. The hazard lights blinked in the darkness, casting rhythmic flashes across the road. Yet it was the shadows moving around the vehicle that told a different story. Slowing the truck, João leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. He saw 4 figures pacing near the doors of the bus. Their movements were not casual, not the restless shifting of stranded passengers. They carried themselves with sharp precision, their posture tense, alert, predatory. A jolt ran through him when he caught the metallic glint of something in their hands. Guns. For heartbeat, he considered the possibility that his tired eyes were playing tricks, that maybe this was an argument between travelers or a late-night roadside scuffle. But then, the truth revealed itself. Inside the bus, small silhouettes pressed against the windows. He saw them clearly now, children. Their hands and faces were lit by the harsh blink of the hazard lights, their expressions pale with terror. João felt his chest tighten. This was no accident. This was a trap. Instinct told him to pass by, keep driving, pretend he had seen nothing. After all, he was alone, unarmed and outnumbered. What could one man in a truck do against armed criminals? His rational mind screamed for caution, warning that stopping here could mean disaster. But then another thought struck him, heavier and louder than the fear. If he drove past, those children would be left at the mercy of men who carried weapons and intent in their eyes. João's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Memories of his own daughter flickered across his mind, her laughter, her face pressed against the window when he left for another long trip. If it were her on that bus, if she was staring out in panic, praying for someone to stop, would anyone come? The thought tore through him like lightning. He tapped the brakes gently, slowing his rig even more, his headlights washing across the scene. The criminals turned their heads. For an instant, the entire road froze in silence, as if the night itself held its breath. João felt the weight of their stares. They knew he had seen them. Hesitation gnawed at him. He was no hero. He had no weapon, no plan. The logical choice was retreat. But the sound that broke the silence pushed him past doubt. A muffled sob carried through the night air, faint but undeniable, the cry of a child from inside the bus. That sound pierced everything. João no longer saw strangers' children. He saw every child who trusted adults to keep them safe, every parent who prayed for their return home. He saw innocence cornered by cruelty, and he realized that the decision was no longer his to make. Fate had put him on this road at this exact moment for a reason. He inhaled slowly, the cab of the truck filling with the low growl of the idling engine. The men near the bus shifted uneasily, glancing between the massive truck and each other. The tension grew heavier with each passing second, pressing down on João's chest like a stone. He could not yet see the ending, but he knew this was the beginning. The road was no longer just a path between two cities. It had become a battlefield, and João, an ordinary truck driver, was standing at its edge. And now he had seconds to decide, turn back into the darkness or step into the fire. The night felt heavier as João's truck crept closer, its headlights illuminating the chilling tableau before him. The school bus, stranded and trembling with life inside, had become a cage. The armed men surrounding it shifted restlessly, their eyes darting toward the massive vehicle, now approaching with an ominous rumble. The hum of João's engine echoed like a warning drumbeat across the empty road. Inside the cab, João's pulse raced in sync with the growl of the diesel engine. His mind was a storm of possibilities. He could floor the accelerator and plow through, scattering the criminals with brute force. He could slam on the brakes, keep his distance, and hope his presence alone was enough to scare them off. Or he could retreat into the shadows, saving himself while abandoning the innocent souls in that bus. Every option carried weight. Every second stolen by hesitation increased the danger for the children. The criminals reacted quickly to his presence. One of them stepped forward, raising his arm in a sharp motion, signaling him to stop. Another lifted what João now clearly saw was a rifle, its barrel gleaming under the strobing hazard lights. The message was unmistakable: keep moving, or this situation would erupt into violence. João swallowed hard. He was not trained for this. He was a man of roads, of schedules, of miles and deliveries. But as his headlights swept across the faces pressed against the bus windows, he caught a glimpse of terror too raw to ignore. Tiny hands clutched the glass. Some children buried their faces in their arms. Others stared wide-eyed at the approaching truck as if praying it might bring salvation. That single image burned itself into Joan's mind. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. The silence of the countryside only amplified the standoff. Even the crickets seemed to have gone quiet, as if nature itself was frozen by the weight of what was unfolding. Joan's breathing grew shallow. The steering wheel trembled under his tightening grip. He knew the next moments would define not just his night, but his life. Then one of the men struck the side of the bus with his weapon, the metallic clang ripping through the night. The children inside jumped back in unison, their screams muffled but audible. Joan's heart lurched at the sound. It was no longer a question of whether the criminals were dangerous, it was proof. They were willing to use fear and force to get what they wanted. Joan's instincts screamed at him to act, yet fear pressed down harder, whispering in his ear, "They have guns, you only have a truck. If you miscalculate, you will die here, and so will those children." He felt the sweat roll down his back, despite the cool night air. But alongside the fear rose something else, anger. Anger at the sight of armed men using their power against the defenseless. Anger at the injustice of children being made to suffer in a world where their only crime was being on the wrong bus, on the wrong night. That anger hardened his resolve. The criminals, sensing his hesitation, began to reposition. Two moved closer to the front of the bus, as if preparing to force entry. Another kept his weapon raised toward Joan's truck, daring him to make a move. The situation was unraveling fast, and Joan realized he could no longer remain a passive observer. Every second he delayed tightened the criminals' grip on their victims. His thoughts sharpened with clarity. He could not outgun them, but he could outmaneuver them. His truck was more than a machine. It was a fortress on wheels, heavy enough to block, powerful enough to shield. If he used it right, he could create a barrier, buy time, and give the children a chance. Joan shifted his foot, pressing the accelerator lightly. The engine roared louder, reverberating across the road. The criminals flinched, their faces illuminated by the piercing beams of the headlights. The tension snapped tighter, stretched to its limit, ready to shatter. In that moment, Joan understood he was already part of this fight. There was no turning back. The lives of those children were tethered to the choices he made in the next few seconds. The road had become a crucible, and Joan was the only one standing between innocence and destruction. The roar of the truck's engine filled the night like a thunderclap, echoing through the empty stretch of highway. Joan's hands were steady now, no longer trembling on the wheel. The hesitation that had weighed him down had burned away, replaced by a fierce clarity. He knew the risk, he knew the danger, but he also knew that if he did nothing, those children would never see their families again. He pressed harder on the accelerator, and the truck surged forward, headlights blazing like floodlights across the trapped bus and its captors. The sudden movement jolted the criminals. One of them shouted something Joan couldn't hear over the engine's roar, but the panic in the man's body language was unmistakable. Another raised his rifle, the barrel flashing in the harsh white light, but Joan didn't slow down. The truck was too massive, too unstoppable, and fear flickered across their faces. With a calculated maneuver, Joan swerved his rig into position, sliding the truck across the asphalt to form a wall of steel between the bus and the armed men. Tires screeched against the pavement, and the sound of grinding rubber tore through the night. Sparks spat from the road as the trailer skidded sideways, blocking the criminals' path. The bus, once exposed and vulnerable, now stood shielded by a fortress of metal. Inside the bus, children pressed closer to the windows, their wide eyes glowing with a mix of shock and fragile hope. For the first time that night, they were not staring at the faces of their captors. They were staring at the silhouette of someone standing up for them. Joan's act had shifted the balance. The criminals cursed, waving their weapons furiously, but the truck's presence forced them to step back. One of them fired a shot, the sharp crack tearing through the air. The bullet struck harmlessly against the side of Joan's trailer, leaving nothing but a dent. Joan's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. He leaned on the horn, blasting a deafening sound that rolled like thunder across the highway, a signal of defiance that shattered the silence of the countryside. The horn served more than one purpose. It was not only a weapon of intimidation, but also a call for help, a beacon to anyone nearby who might hear it. João laid on it again, long and unbroken, daring the criminals to try and advance. The bus's headlights flickered as if in answer, and João saw the faces of the children pressed even harder against the glass. Their fear had not vanished, but now there was something else mingled with it. Faith. The criminals regrouped quickly, anger rising in their movements. Two attempted to circle around, trying to find a way past the barricade of steel. João anticipated it. He shifted gears, the truck groaning as it moved just enough to block them again. Each time they tried to advance, the towering mass of his vehicle cut them off, pushing them further into the open, exposing them to the risk of being seen by anyone approaching. Adrenaline surged through João's veins. His chest pounded, but his focus was unbreakable. He was no longer just a driver on a lonely night shift. He was the shield between the innocent and the violent, and every instinct in his body screamed to hold the line. Another gunshot rang out, this time closer. A flash lit up near the front of the bus, and João ducked instinctively, though the bullet ricocheted harmlessly off the metal frame of his rig. The sound ignited his determination further. If the criminals wanted to break through, they would have to go through him, and through the steel beast he commanded. The standoff grew hotter by the second. The truck's engine rumbled, the horn wailed, and the criminals' frustration deepened. They had expected easy prey, a bus of frightened children and no resistance. Instead, they now faced a man who had turned a machine of transport into a weapon of protection. In that moment, João realized the truth of what he had done. He had bought time for someone to call the police, time for reinforcements to arrive, time for hope to spread inside that bus. His act of courage was not about defeating the criminals alone. It was about refusing to let them win without a fight. He pressed the horn again, long and loud, and held his ground. The road no longer belonged to the criminals. It belonged to the trucker who had chosen to be a shield. The sound of João's horn still reverberated across the night when the first sign of hope appeared in the distance. Far down the highway, faint beams of headlights broke through the darkness, small glimmers that grew brighter with every passing second. The criminals noticed them too, their frantic gestures betraying the fear of losing control. What had begun as a carefully orchestrated ambush was slipping away, unraveling because one man had dared to intervene. Inside the bus, the children stirred, whispering, pointing toward the approaching lights. Their fear had not vanished, but their eyes now reflected something new. Expectation. Perhaps rescue was on its way. Perhaps they were not abandoned to fate after all. João caught sight of their faces in his mirrors, and the knot in his chest loosened slightly. His gamble had worked. His act of defiance had bought precious minutes. The first vehicle to arrive was a small car that slowed cautiously, its driver clearly aware that something was terribly wrong. João blared his horn again, using it like a signal flare. The driver, understanding the danger, accelerated past and disappeared into the distance, no doubt rushing to alert authorities at the nearest town. The criminals shouted after the car, waving their weapons in frustration, but their grip on the situation had slipped further. Moments later, another sound joined the chaos, the deep growl of a second truck engine. From the opposite direction, headlights swept the road as another rig approached, this one slowing as its driver took in the scene. João's heart surged. He was no longer alone. The newcomer eased his truck onto the shoulder and stopped, positioning his vehicle at an angle that cut off another escape route. With two massive machines now flanking the bus, the criminals' dominance was shattered. They looked smaller, weaker, boxed in by walls of steel. One of them fired a desperate shot into the air, the sharp crack echoing across the open night. It was a hollow act of bravado, and João knew it. Fear had started to seep into them. Then came the final piece that tipped the scales, the distant wail of sirens. At first it was faint, almost uncertain, but quickly it swelled into a clear, piercing cry. Blue and red lights danced along the horizon, growing larger, faster, closer. Relief swept through Joan's body like a tide. Reinforcements were not just coming, they were almost there. The criminals panicked. They barked orders at one another, some retreating toward the tree line, others hesitating as if caught between fight and flight. Their carefully laid ambush was collapsing, crumbling under the combined weight of defiance and justice. The second truck driver climbed down from his cab, careful but unafraid, his silhouette outlined by the glow of headlights. He shouted something toward Joan, a quick confirmation, a sign of solidarity. Joan nodded in return. They did not need many words. The message was clear enough. They would hold the line together. The bus doors opened slightly, perhaps by the driver inside testing whether it was safe. Joan quickly flashed his headlights twice, a silent reassurance. Not yet, he thought. Wait until the danger is truly gone. The sirens grew louder, the flashing lights filling the highway. Police cruisers roared onto the scene, tires screeching as officers poured out, weapons drawn, voices commanding and authoritative. "Drop your weapons, hands where we can see them." The air that had been thick with fear only moments before now rang with the power of law and order. One by one, the criminals were surrounded, forced to the ground under the blinding beams of police flashlights. Some resisted, others fled into the darkness, but none escaped the tightening circle. Within minutes, the chaos that had threatened to become tragedy was brought under control. Inside the bus, the children erupted into cries of relief. Some clapped, others sobbed, their small voices carrying through the night air like a chorus of survival. Joan watched them, exhausted but unbroken, as the reality of what had happened began to sink in. He had held the line long enough. He had given them the chance they needed, and now they were safe. The reinforcements had arrived, and with them, victory. The highway that had moments, earlier been a stage of fear, was now flooded with flashing blue and red lights. The chaos had given way to order. Officers secured the scene, handcuffing the criminals and herding them away from the bus. Weapons were confiscated, radios crackled with reports, and the sound of authority replaced the threatening silence that had haunted the night. But the most powerful sound of all was the rush of voices. Inside the bus, children crying, laughing and calling for their parents, their fear finally breaking into relief. The bus driver, pale and shaken, slowly opened the doors as officers gestured it was safe. One by one the children descended, clinging to each other, some still trembling with the shock of it all. As they stepped onto the asphalt, they lifted their eyes to the massive truck that still stood guard like a giant sentinel. Their gazes found Joan, who remained in his cab for a long moment, staring out at the scene with an expression that mixed exhaustion and disbelief. He had not planned to be a savior. He had only done what felt impossible not to do. Yet here he was, sitting in the driver's seat of a machine that had become a shield, watching as innocent lives were returned to safety. A police officer approached his door and motioned for him to step out. Joan hesitated, then climbed down slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel. He was met not with suspicion or questions, but with nods of respect. One officer clapped him on the shoulder firmly and said, "You bought us the time we needed. Without you, this could have ended very differently." Joan lowered his eyes, uncomfortable with the praise. He was a truck driver, not a hero. He had never wanted recognition, only to finish his route and return home. But as he looked up again, he saw the children gathered near the bus, many of them pointing toward him. Some waved timidly, others whispered to one another, and a few even shouted thank you through the cool night air. The weight of their gratitude struck him harder than any bullet could have. His chest tightened, his throat constricted. He thought of his own daughter, safe at home, and for the first time allowed himself to imagine what might have been had he chosen differently. If he had driven past, the headlines would have carried tragedy. Instead, they would carry survival. Parents began to arrive shortly after, alerted by the authorities. The reunion was chaotic, full of tears and embraces. Mothers fell to their knees, clutching their children. Fathers wrapped them in protective arms, their relief spilling into sobs. Again and again, eyes turned toward João. They didn't know his name, but they knew what he had done. To them, he was more than a driver. He was the shield that had stood between life and death. Word spread quickly among the officers and onlookers. Stories would be told about that night. About the man who risked his life, with nothing but a truck and an unshakable resolve. At the gas stations and truck stops along the highways, whispers would grow into a legend. They would call him many things: protector, savior, guardian. But one nickname would stick most of all: the Angel of the Road. João listened quietly as the noise of the aftermath swirled around him. He was tired, drained to the core, but he felt a deep sense of peace. He had not sought out glory, but he had faced fear and chosen courage. The children were alive. That was enough. As the last of the criminals were taken away, and the bus was escorted safely back toward the city, João returned to his cab. He placed his hands on the wheel, the familiar leather worn from years of driving, and exhaled slowly. He was just a trucker again, but forever changed. The night had tested him, and though he never asked for it, it had made him a hero. That night on the highway proved something unforgettable. True heroes are not always the ones wearing uniforms or holding medals. Sometimes they are ordinary people who make extraordinary choices in the most terrifying moments. João was just a truck driver, a man like so many others who lived a life of hard work and routine. Yet when faced with injustice, he chose courage over fear. This story reminds us of a truth we often forget. Every one of us carries the power to protect, to step forward when it matters most. Most people may never face criminals on a dark road, but every day we encounter situations where someone needs our voice, our strength, or our help. The question is, will we act? And that brings us to you. If you had been there that night alone on the road, would you have had the courage to stop? Or would fear have held you back? Think about it, because in moments of crisis, the decision of one person can change everything. Share your thoughts in the comments, because your perspective matters and may inspire someone else who watches this story. If this video moved you, give it a like so more people can see the story of João, the truck driver who became a shield. Subscribe to our channel, because this is only one of many real stories of courage, danger, and survival that we bring to life here. And stay with us, because in the next video you will discover another story even more unbelievable, one that will leave you questioning how far ordinary people can go when fate tests them. You don't want to miss it.